We're continuing this morning on our series, Thy Kingdom Come. And I don't know if you read the newspaper or heard on the news, but in the Times Colonist on Wednesday this week, there was a story, man likely seeking warmth found dead in recycling truck. I don't know if you heard that story. It starts like this. A Victoria man whose body was discovered in a recycling truck was likely homeless and trying to keep warm when he died, according to Central Saanich Police. Police are not publicly identifying the man, who was in his 20s. His body was discovered about 8:30 a.m. on November 12th when a recycling truck returned to the waste collection facility. And they figured the man was in a cardboard recycling, container bin thing, keeping warm, and the truck dumped him into the back and then crushed him when they compacted the cardboard. And I heard that story this week. I read it, and then I heard it on the news, and I thought to myself, something's wrong. Something is wrong that in our city, one of the finest cities in the world, people die in the back of a recycling truck, or even they're in a bin trying to keep warm in cardboard. Something is wrong. And we're in a series I just mentioned called Thy Kingdom Come, and we're looking at the first church, the early church, and we're seeing how did the early church have an impact that changed the world. And we've been looking at this process slide, and we see, first of all, and we talked about this, they prayed, and as they prayed, they were filled with the Spirit, and then they loved one another. And people noticed how they loved one another, and then they loved others. They went out and loved others. We're going to look at that in a minute. And then we saw that they performed miraculous deeds. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago, and we looked at works and words and wonders. And after Christmas, we're going to look at the whole idea of them telling people about Jesus. But this morning, what I want us to focus in on is that the early church loved others, especially the poor. When you look at the early church, the first few centuries of the early church, you see that they loved the poor because they knew God was passionate about how the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable were treated. Some things in the Bible, many things in the Bible are a mystery. Some things in the Bible are no-brainers. And one of the no-brainers is that it matters to God how the poor are treated. Listen to these verses. Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Isaiah 58, verse 10. Feed the hungry and help those in trouble. Then your light will shine out from the darkness, and the darkness around you will be as bright as noon. The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. Proverbs 31, verse 8. Speak up for the people who have no voice, for the rights of all the down and outers. Speak out for justice. Stand up for the poor and the destitute. God looks down on this world and he sees the 9-year-old girl forced into sex slavery. He looks down and he sees the family of 8 living in a cardboard shack. He looks down, he sees the homeless on the streets of our city. He sees the millions who die because of lack of access to clean drinking water. He looks down and he sees the shoeless person. He sees the addict trying to get help. He sees millions of orphans all over this world. God looks down on all of that, and God gets ticked. Listen to Amos chapter 5, starting in verse 21 from the Message translation. It says this, this is God speaking, I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religious projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. And you look in the Gospels and you see that Jesus said in the Gospels that giving to the poor was one of the main examples of genuine faith. In fact, in the verses we just read, did you notice how serious those verses are? Jesus said, the primary means by which you'll sort out the wicked from the righteous on Judgment Day is how we cared for the poor. Caring for the poor, caring for the marginalized, caring for the oppressed is not just a good idea. It's an essential part of being a follower of Jesus. And then, of course, there's our verse that really is what our church is all about. That's Micah 6:8, where it says, He has shown you, a person, what is good and what does God require of you? Here it is. Here's what God requires of us. To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. We act justly when we stand up for and act on what is right. We act justly when we care for and stand up for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized in our society. Proverbs 29:7 says this, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. The word translated care about there is very intense in the Hebrew. The righteous, that's people like you and us, people that follow Jesus, are to have a deep, gut-level passion about justice for the poor and the oppressed. We are called by God to be people who care for, who stand up for the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable and the oppressed. And the early church took that call very seriously. From multiple early sources, Christian, Jewish, Roman, we know that one of the distinguishing marks of the early church was their care and compassion for the poor and the vulnerable. Actually, listen to these verses. It started right when the church was formed in Acts 2. Listen to these verses. Acts 2, verse 44 and 45. Listen to this. This is crazy stuff. Even the believers, all the believers were together and had everything in common. Look at this. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. So anyone in their fellowship who had need, they would sell property and possessions to make sure those persons' needs were met. In Acts 4, it says this, for there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of land and houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. That's amazing. Sacrificial generosity to care for those in need. And church historians tell us that the Christ followers not only cared and shared with their own people in their church, but they also gave generously to those outside their walls. In fact, the early church was known and respected by its persecutors, including the Romans, for the compassionate acts they had towards the poor and the oppressed in their society. From AD 251 to 266, a great epidemic struck the Roman Empire. At its height, 5,000 people a day were dying in the city of Rome alone. Pope Dionysius wrote an Easter letter around 260 AD that a substantial number of Christ followers had lost their lives while caring for others. As this epidemic went on, as Christ followers cared for the sick and the dying, they got sick and died themselves because they were caring for the sick and the dying. Diogenes wrote this: most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. And with them departed this life, listen to this, serenely happy. Many in nursing and curing others transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. In the 4th century, when a plague hit Caesarea, and Caesarea was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire at the time, the people in the city fled. They got out of the city. There was a mass exodus. Everyone except for one group fled the city. The one group that stayed behind? Christians. They stayed behind to care for the sick and the dying. The bishop of the city and a historian of the early church, Eusebius, wrote that during the plague, he said this: all day long the Christians tended to the dying and to their burial, countless numbers with no one to care for them. Eusebius goes on to state that because of their compassion in the midst of the plague, this is what he said: the Christians' deeds were on everyone's lips and they glorified the God of the Christians. Isn't that awesome? A few decades later, the Emperor Julian wrote about the Christian practice of compassion, and writing to a pagan priest, he said this: when it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the pagan priest, then I think the impious Galileans, that's the Christians, observed this fact and devoted themselves to philanthropy. They support not only their poor, but ours as well. And all men see that our people lacked aid from us. And Julian goes on and he says that pagan priests need to copy the charity and the compassion of the Christians in order to bring about a revival of paganism in the empire. During the first centuries of the church, it was not Christian worship that attracted people to the church. It was not Christian programs that attracted people to the church. It was how Christ followers lived that attracted people to the church. It's how they cared for one another and how they cared for others that attracted people to Jesus. As one person wrote, the outsiders looked at the Christians and saw them energetically feeding poor people and burying them, caring for boys and girls who lacked property and parents, and being attentive to aged slaves and prisoners. And folks, we need to be challenged by the early church. We can get so focused on our own lives. We can get so focused on church programs. We can get so focused on church stuff that we miss what is really important. And what's really important? God tells us what's really important. Walk humbly with Him, love mercy, and act justly. Remember what Eusebius wrote? The deeds of the Christ followers were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Shouldn't that still be true today? Shouldn't people in our city be looking at the churches in our city, the Christ followers in our city, and because of our deeds and the way we care for people outside these walls, shouldn't people be glorifying our God? Because of the way we care for the poor and the oppressed and the vulnerable amongst us? You see, God's call has not changed. God's still calling Christ followers like He called those early Christians. God has a heart for the poor. And yet, and I think all of us would agree with this, if we compare the church in North America today to the early church, there's a gap. in the way we care for the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. And why the difference? Why are we not acting like the early church acted? Why the difference? I think there's several reasons, but as I was preparing the sermon, I was reflecting, and I wrote down 3, and I want to share with them. 3 reasons why we're not like the early church when it comes to caring for the poor and the oppressed. Oh, we do some, but we don't do it to the degree that the early church did. Here's the first one. First reason why we're not like the early church. I think it's easy today to be judgmental. Have you noticed that? It's easy for us to question why the poor are poor. Like you're walking downtown Victoria and you see a homeless guy, and you look at the homeless guy and you think to yourself, go get a job. Go work at Tim Hortons or McDonald's. Go get a job. Why don't you work? Or you drive through one of the reserves on the peninsula and you see the mess. And you go, why don't you guys clean this up? You know, up to a couple of years ago, that was my attitude. I don't know about you. I drive through a reserve and say, do you really have to live like this? And over the last couple of years, I've been on a journey of learning and unlearning. And that's changed my heart and changed my focus. But it's easy to be judgmental, isn't it? This Friday night and Saturday morning, our leadership team and a few of the people in our learning community had the privilege of spending some time with Dr. Cheryl Bear. You'll get to hear from her in the new year. And Dr. Cheryl Bear is an indigenous Christian leader here in our country. And she was just sharing some of her story with us. And she was talking about how in when she grew up in Vanderhoof, she lived just outside Vanderhoof, but she would go into Vanderhoof as a little girl with her mom, and this is in the 70s. And in Vanderhoof in the 70s, she would walk the streets with her mom, and there would be signs on the doors of the shops, no Indians allowed. And she said to us, those signs have been removed. They're no longer there, but those signs still hang in many hearts today. We judge. It's so easy to judge the poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed. But I would suggest to you we're asking the wrong questions. We're asking the wrong questions. Listen, when you read the Bible, here's something we need to understand. God doesn't qualify caring for the poor. God doesn't qualify caring for the poor. He doesn't say, just care for those poor who didn't put themselves in that situation, or just care for this group of poor people, or just care for this group of poor. God doesn't qualify caring for the poor. God says, as followers of Him, we are called to care for the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed. We often ask the wrong questions. What we need to be asking is questions like this. As the poor in our city struggle, do they know Jesus cares for them? As the poor in our city cry, do they know Jesus wipes away their tears? Do the poor in our city know that the churches of our city are there for them? Or even a bigger question, are the churches in our city there for the poor? Someone has said, instead of judging the poor, help them. Here's something I've realized in my own life. Maybe it's true for you. It's actually fairly easy to stomach poverty and judge the impoverished as long as I look at numbers on a page. I read this week in Canada, there's 150,000 homeless people. And we go, oh, that's too bad. Right? It's easy to judge, it's easy to ignore when the poor, the oppressed, the vulnerable are just a statistic. But everything changes when you get to know a family living in poverty. Everything changes when you get to know a homeless person. I've watched a massive change in my son, Chris. Chris went to Winnipeg to go to university, and he chose with some friends to live on the roughest street in Winnipeg, Furby. He lived on Furby Street, roughest area, crazy area, lots of violence, lots of drugs. He lived there. They lived there to try to make a difference. But over his 4 years in Winnipeg, Chris developed a heart for the homeless community. And he got to know the homeless people. And it was incredible when I was out there for his grad with Sylvia, and we're walking through downtown Winnipeg, and the homeless people are saying, "Hi, Chris, how you doing?" And Chris is going, "Hi, George. Hi, Fred." And as he got to know the homeless people, and he got to hear their stories and know their names, it changed his heart. And the same thing happens to us. When we get to know people that are impoverished, it changes our heart. You know, I always knew that Mexico had a lot of poverty. But it wasn't until I was standing in Mexico several years ago in this corrugated metal building area where human beings were living like cattle in this corrugated metal shacks. And I got to meet these families and talk to these families and engage these families. And at that moment, my heart broke. It's when we get to know the poor. It's when we get to know the oppressed that everything changes. Someone has said this: "You say you care about the poor, then tell me, what are their names?" And I would say to us, church, let's get to know their names. Second reason that we're not quite like the early church when it comes to caring for the poor is this: it's easy, so easy, for us to choose consumption over compassion. In our culture, it's easy to buy into the idea. It's so easy to buy into the idea that more, newer, bigger is better and will bring happiness and fulfillment. And it doesn't matter how old you are, we buy into that. It is just drilled into our skulls in this consumeristic culture. We're about to go into Christmas season. Go ask the average child, what makes a great Christmas? And what are you going to hear? You're going to hear lots of gifts, getting what I want. In other words, stuff equals a great Christmas. Is that really healthy? Now, before you think I'm going Grinch on you, I'm not saying you shouldn't give gifts at Christmas. Gift giving is fine to a point, but listen, parents, grandparents, listen. I would say one of the best gifts we can give our children is to teach them to care for the least of these. We need to remember, as Christ followers, we pledge allegiance to a different kingdom. We do not pledge allegiance to the culture of the shopping mall. We do not pledge allegiance to this culture we live in. We pledge allegiance to the King of Kings and His kingdom. And in His kingdom, compassion is supposed to win over consumption. We've been blessed not so we can consume more and more, but so we can show greater and greater amounts of compassion. And so let's be people who consistently choose compassion over consumption. People who live a lifestyle of sacrificial generosity, just like the early church. It's easy to judge. It's easy to choose consumption over compassion in our culture. And thirdly, let me say this: it is so easy for us to get overwhelmed. We look at the issue of global poverty. We even look at the issues of poverty and homelessness and all of that in our own city, and it can become overwhelming. And we can find ourselves asking, what can I do? What can we do? But I want to say to you this morning, you may not be able to change the world. But as you live 6-8, as you walk humbly with Jesus, as you love mercy, as you act justly, you can change someone's world. You probably heard the story of the old man who was walking along the shore of a beach after a big storm, and there were literally thousands and thousands of starfish that had been washed up on this beach. And as the old man walked along this beach, he saw a young boy coming towards him. And this young boy was picking something up and throwing it in the water. And finally, the boy got close to the old man, and the old man asked, "Son, what are you doing?" And the boy said, I'm throwing starfish into the ocean. And the old man said, "But there are thousands of starfish on the beach. I'm afraid you're not really going to be able to make much of a difference." And the young boy bent down and he picked up a starfish and threw it in the water. And he looked at the old man and he smiled and he said, "Maybe not, but it made a difference for that one." And here's the point. Well, you probably got the point. We can't meet every need. We can't correct every injustice, but we can, just like the early church, filled with the Holy Spirit, we individually and collectively can go out and make a difference. We can build houses so people don't have to live in cardboard shacks. And we're doing that in Mexico. And I know there was an announcement earlier, I missed it, about a Mexico meeting. But if you haven't been to Mexico to build a school or a house, you should go in March. It'll change your life and it'll change someone else's life. We can educate children both here and in Mexico because we know that education is one of the key tools in breaking a poverty cycle. We can bless those who are less fortunate this Christmas season by picking the trees at the back clean for Serve the City Christmas edition. We can care for single-parent families. I don't know if you know, we do this. One of the ways we do it is car care for single moms here. But can I challenge you? If you knew a single-parent family in your realm of influence, adopt them and love on them. My wife and I have adopted a single mom in her 30s and her two little kids, and for a few years now, we've just loved on them. And at times it's trying, at times it's a blessing, but we're loving on them. And we need to do that as a church. If you know a single parent family, adopt them, love on them, care for them. We can create a dream center that will walk alongside, and we are creating a dream center that will walk alongside First Nations people. Stand with them as they address issues of oppression and poverty in their own lives. We can care for those in our realms of influence. Let me ask you a question. Who in your realm of influence, your workplace, your school, your neighborhood, do you know that's poor, oppressed, marginalized, vulnerable? What about that homeless person you pass every day as you walk to work? Who in your realm of influence can Jesus call you to care for? You say, "Well, I don't have any poor or vulnerable or marginalized in my realm of influence." Go find some then. And let me also say this. We can also do Christmas differently. And it's been a few years since I've talked to you about this. I've talked to you about this in the past, but it fits today. And I want to talk to us a little bit today and close out with this thought. We can do Christmas differently. And in doing Christmas differently, we can bless the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized in our city. When you look at that first Christmas, you see a redistribution of wealth. Jesus, who had everything, became poor so that we who are poor could enter into the wealth of his life. Jesus did not cling to status or stature. Instead, he laid it all down. He gave it all up so that we could find hope and life in him. And what if we followed his example this Advent season, which begins next Sunday? What if we who are rich gave so others who are poor could find life and hope? Did you know that 2,500 children will die today because of waterborne illnesses. Do you know it would take $13 billion, that's with a B, $13 billion to give clean water to everyone in this world? And you're thinking, where would we get $13 billion from? Well, Canadians will spend approximately $30 billion with a B dollars on Christmas this year. And if that doesn't blow you away, here's something that will. A World Vision study in England found that Britons, get this, waste over $4.5 billion every Christmas on unwanted Christmas gifts. $4.5 billion on unwanted Christmas gifts. And so what if this Christmas season, we, here at Saanich, changed the question from what can I get to God has blessed me, so how can I bless others? In other words, what if we spent less, then took the money we saved, because we spent less on gifts, and gave it away so others could find life and hope? The average person in BC this year will spend $840. The average adult in BC will spend $840 on Christmas gifts. And you may say that's not you, but I'm talking average, so $840, we'll go with average. $840 on Christmas gifts. So what if you spent half the average this year? Say you're an average adult and you said, I'm going to spend half the average. So I'm going to spend $420. That would mean you have $420 left, right? So what happens if you just took $210 and didn't put it on your credit card, but the other $210 you saved, so half of what you saved, you gave away to the least of these? Now you say, well, $210, that doesn't seem like a lot. But if 500 adults who went to Saanich Baptist Church gave away $210, together we'd give away $105,000 this Christmas to the least of these. Would that make a difference? Just seeing if you're with me. And you maybe say, but how do I cut back at Christmas? How do I cut back? The kid wants the new game box, and how do I cut back? Let me give you a couple of ways to do it. First, make a list of all the people you're supposed to give Christmas gifts to. Then all those ones that you really don't want to give gifts to, that you feel you're duty bound to, scratch their name off the list. Listen, they will only be mad at you for one Christmas. And then they're going to be relieved because they probably feel duty bound to give you a gift as well. And then of the people left that you really feel you need to give gifts to, cut back. Cut back on what you give. In fact, even ask yourself, a few years ago, us as our family, like our larger family on both Sylvia's side and my side, we all had a conversation around who really do we need to give gifts to? Like, do I really need a gift card to Starbucks from my sister at Christmas? No, I don't. And so we started to really cut back on both sides, and it saved a ton of money and a ton of time and a ton of stress. And then we were able to take some of that money and bless others. And so start to have that conversation with your family. Like, who do we really need to give gifts to? And how much do we really need to spend? And then take some of the money that you save from buying less gifts and talk to your family. If you've got kids, involve your kids in this. Talk to your family about how you can bless the least of these. One of the great things we did a few years ago when our kids were smaller is we engaged them. And Chris said to us, he said, the people on the street, it's cold, they need gloves. And so we took a bunch of the money that we saved and we went out and we bought gloves. And we as a family went downtown one night and distributed gloves to the homeless people. That was a double blessing. We blessed them, they blessed us. Imagine going back to work after Christmas, and rather than saying, I got another stupid tie from Uncle John this year, being able to say, this year, my family and us, we went out and we blessed some of the people in the city that need to be blessed. And then tell your story of how you did that. You know, if hundreds of us do that, we're going to impact the city this Christmas. Jesus said this in Matthew 5. He said, you are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Let's shine brightly this Christmas season. Let's be like the early church this Christmas season. Let's give sacrificially to those in need this Christmas season. And then let it be said of us, the deeds of those Christ followers were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Wouldn't that be awesome? Let me pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you that the early church sets a high bar for us. God, I pray that we would rise to that level. God, don't let us be judgmental, but let us have your heart for the poor. Don't let us get trapped in the consumption cycle. Rather, let your compassion grip us. And Father, don't let us be overwhelmed, but let us see that just making a difference for the one is what you're calling us to do. And as we do that, the impact grows and your name is glorified. In Jesus' name, amen.